Welcome, everyone, to the Dynasty Fantasy Football Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I am your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, the lead Dynasty analyst at the 33rd Team, Ian Miller. It is your time for the monthly update. His Dynasty rankings are about to hit the site again. Every single week, you get the updates, but I think every month it's important to talk about someone that's not just maybe rising a spot or two, but has a pretty drastic change in value. Today's show, we're going to go rapid fire. We've got 3 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 3 receivers, and 3 tight ends to discuss that have a pretty big value change from last month to this month. Let's begin with the quarterbacks and CJ Stroud. Now, Ian, Stroud has averaged 277 pass yards a game this year. That's 4th in the NFL. At 7.8 yards per pass attempt. So he's been efficient. That's also 4th in the NFL. He's thrown 9 touchdowns, 1 interception. He's doing it behind an offensive line that's been banged up all year. Nobody in the world liked the weapons that the Texans were offering heading into this season. Robert Woods, Nico Collins, Tank Dell was not inspiring confidence in anyone prior to the start of the season. With how well Stroud's been playing with this supporting cast, how high should he continue to rise in the rankings? And do you think there's any chance that he can reach the Joe Burrow level value by the end of this season? You're on mute.
Great start.
Yeah, great start.
Well, I think you bring up a good point is that we've seen CJ Stroud just absolutely basically electrify the league to start the year. We get a rookie quarterback that's kind of doing things that we haven't seen a rookie quarterback do since we saw the Justin Herberts and the Joe Burrows of the world. And I think the Joe Burrows is a solid comparison in that we have someone who started out the league as a good passer, which is something you don't usually see from rookie quarterbacks. Like you mentioned with CJ Stroud, he's someone who's also scoring a lot of points, 20.2 points per game through the first 7 weeks. And he's doing that with 19.7 passing points per game. So the other thing about that is, yes, we're talking about a guy that's near the top of the league in adjusted yards per attempt with 8.4. His yards per attempt is 7.8, which, as you mentioned, is 4th. The guy is clearly a good passer and someone who is definitely a dynasty QB1. But the thing when we talk about Burrow that kind of gets people miss when they talk about the Burrow profile is that, yes, he is one of the best passers in the league, and his rookie year in terms of passing is very comparable to CJ Stroud. The issue is that Joe Burrow, as a rookie, averaged over 3 points per game as a rusher. And then this past year, before obviously the calf injury, he also averaged above 3 points per game as a rusher. So that's kind of something that you need in fantasy football because you don't see guys who do not rush end up with this amazing high upside fantasy season. Take a guy like Tua, for example. Tua is leading the league in adjusted yards per attempt, passing touchdown rate, yards per attempt. He's one of the best passing quarterbacks in the league and the best this year when you're looking peripheral-wise. And yet he finds himself outside the top 5 quarterbacks and actually at QB7 because he's averaging 0.3 rushing points per game. So when you have someone who doesn't rush, even though we're talking about 2, 3, we're not talking about, Lamar Jackson or anything, but those points add up and brings you to that upside. Like Josh Allen, for example, Patrick Mahomes, for example. You may not think of them as crazy rushers, but if it wasn't for their rushing production, they're also not top 5 guys. So with CJ Stroud, he's someone who's definitely a dynasty quarterback one. He's proven himself as a very strong passer and likely has high upside like Tua Tagovailoa in that sense. But without being a rushing quarterback or at least have adequate scrambling ability, at least in terms of fantasy, then that high-end upside is kind of really hard to envision.
You can find Ian at Dynasty_IM on Twitter. His Dynasty rankings will be up on the33rdteam.com soon. Those are free each week. Not only do you get his full Dynasty rankings, but you're also going to get write-ups from him, adding some context to some of the guys rising and falling. You talked a lot about rushing production. Let's just turn to 2 quarterbacks that provide a lot of it. We'll start with Justin Fields. Fields has had his moments this year for fantasy. He had back-to-back weeks with around 30 fantasy points at one point. But I don't think he's shown enough for me to think this is the long-term starter for the Bears. The Bears have been pretty bad this year. If they have a high pick in next year's draft, I'm inclined to believe they would select Caleb Williams or Drake May at quarterback. That being said, though, Fields' value has already been dropping quite a bit this year. just going to give you a quick shout out. This offseason, you were the lowest analyst that I could find in the industry on Justin Fields and Dynasty, simply because you envisioned a scenario quite like this, where the supporting cast gets better, Fields' numbers get a little bit better, but you look and still go, you know what? When this guy gets expensive in a couple of years, we do not want to pay him. We do not want a Daniel Jones situation. Now, at what point, as Fields' value is dropping, would you become a buyer in Dynasty? Or do you think of Fields kind of as like this falling knife where, yes, the value's falling, but you expect it to kind of keep falling, and you simply don't want to get stuck with a quarterback that, next thing you know, is turning into someone like a Sam Darnold?
Yeah, I think you make good points, because part of the reason that I wasn't in on Fields is because of how much he cost. And it took basically all the downside risk out of the Justin Fields profile. Because right now he's actually having his best passing season of his career. But the thing is, it's not exactly that great. The film grades say it's better than it's been, but it's not great. His adjusted yards per attempt is 7.1. That's very adequate. And he's throwing 17 passing points per game, which is a clear career best. The issue with that is there's a few, like you mentioned, getting replaced. So when we talk about Justin Fields, maybe he winds up elsewhere. But then you're talking about a guy who's on his second team, where the first team he was with ended up as a failure, and the hit rate of those, while I don't have them on hand, is pretty sad. And the other thing, too, is it's not one of those things where the Bears won this week so they can play themselves out of it. It's not like Justin Fields can play so good that they are now out of the quarterback conversation. Because when we talk about quarterbacks, at least looking at profiles and the team wanting to add an inexpensive option that they want to have to play that could be a good passer, there's at least two in Caleb Williams and Drake May that we see that it's hard to see any GM wanting to stick with a Fields who will be more expensive versus a rookie quarterback here. And the problem with that is, okay, so you're looking at maybe the top two picks. Okay, the Bears played themselves out of the top two picks, but now you still have to rely on Bryce Young's squad not being in the top two picks, because the chances of them having a top two pick are much higher than basically every other team, because they're as a team are not very good, and then we've seen that. But even if they do play themselves out, it's the 0-6 Carolina Panthers that now have to play themselves out for them to not be in position to get a Caleb Williams or Drake May. So from the Bears' perspective, yeah, this is great. We get this. But from a Justin Fields fantasy perspective, yes, you could find himself on a second team, but the hit rate's low. And he has never proven to be a good passer, even this year in a career best season, where he's not even above the average for a starting quarterback in the NFL when we look at peripherals like yards per attempt, adjusted yards per attempt, touchdown rate. He is, because they throw so low, but his film grades are also pretty poor. So it's kind of a falling knife situation, but sure, there's always at some point where that value becomes intriguing.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Justin Fields' dynasty value is getting hammered from not just the Bears being bad, but Bryce Young and the Panthers, whose first-round pick they own for next year, being the only team that is still winless through 7 weeks. I mentioned there'd be another Russian quarterback. We legally have to talk about Anthony Richardson. Everyone wants to know what the heck we do with him. He's missing the entire 2023 season now with the shoulder surgery that he's undergoing. He's probably going to have to change a little bit of his play style next year to stay healthier. It kind of looks like he tried to be the Cam Newton, Josh Allen in terms of contact that he's taking. And I think he quickly learned that Cam Newton and Josh Allen look like the true outliers when it comes to the amount of contact they can take per game while still remaining relatively healthy. What should we be doing? He's rotting on our benches right now, but the 2 full games he played, he was absolutely fantastic for fantasy football.
Yeah, I think the sad thing with Anthony Richardson is that the whole game theory behind it too is, okay, you take Anthony Richardson, he's very likely to be a strong peripheral rusher, and he absolutely proved that. In fact, but if you don't count these half games, or even if you count these half games besides the one that he ended with the AC joint, he had the most rushing points per game that a rookie quarterback has ever had. He was above 10. It would have been one of the highest we've ever seen, actually, not just from a rookie. So you got that with Anthony Richardson, and that turned into very quick production, and he didn't have to be a good passer in doing so. And the game theory behind it was, okay, he doesn't have to be a good passer as a rookie quarterback anyways, and he's still going to score you fantasy points, and then you can assess going into year 2 where you feel, can he make that jump as a passer? Now, we're lucky enough that this isn't a year 2 injury, and we're going into a year 3. We don't know if he's a good passer. And we saw it last year. The guy we just talked about, Justin Fields, he was an atrocious passer in year 2, but he rushed a lot, and he still found himself with first-round startup value. So Anthony Richardson is still a plenty safe value. Next season, he'll find himself around round 1 startup prices, at the very worst, the beginning of round 2. So you have an asset that's very, very insulated. It's very safe and very strong. But it's going to be one of those things where you're looking in year 2 and he could blow the world up again as a rusher, but he has to prove in year 2 that he can be a solid passer for you to like him at that kind of value in Dynasty.
Guys, Dynasty_IM. Make sure you're following Ian on Twitter. His Dynasty rankings are on the33rdteam.com. If you're listening to the Dynasty show, but you also play Redraft, my fantasy rankings are up right now for week 8 on the site, and my rest of season rankings and the downloadable PDF color-coded trade value chart will hit the site later tonight as well. You'll notice some interesting movement there, and I regret to inform everyone that my beloved Chargers fandom with Justin Herbert has hit a crossroads. He fell a full tier. He has simply not been the same this year without Mike Williams. On a more happy note, let's turn to a running back that we're both very optimistic about, in Alvin Kamara. He now has at least 17 PPR fantasy points all 4 games this year. He's averaging 21 per game this year. 17 carries a game, 10 targets a game. That kind of feels like a Christian McCaffrey, Marshall Faulk type stat line. I cannot believe what we're seeing. These numbers are not going to last rest of season, though. But at the same time, even if he drops significantly from 10 targets a game, again, we're starting at 10 targets a game. A lot of margin there for them to come down and for you to still have a fantasy RB1. He is 28 years old, but if we look at the contract situation, if the Saints cut him after this year, they get nearly $17 million in dead cap losses. I don't think they're going to do that. If you're a contending team, which a lot of people listening will have at least one contending dynasty team, what are a couple players or concrete offers that you could make to pluck Kamara off of someone else's squad? Because right now, he looks like a locked and loaded top 6 fantasy running back rest of season.
Yeah, I think before even saying that, we should give ourselves a little pat on the back, because this is someone that we advocated for all offseason. Whether we're talking about Dynasty in this case, where we said even rebuilding teams, take a guy like Alvin Kamara. You won't take any points for the first 3 weeks, and then he comes back and does what he does, and all of a sudden he goes from like RB33 in consensus rankings and values to a fringe running back 1. So it was one of those things where it was really easy to see, because this is someone that even last year was top 3 in running back target share, and he has been every single year of his career. And this year obviously is no different. One of the funniest tweets I saw was from Matt Harmon, and it talked about Derek Carr being a chuck down guy. And it brought up how he now has Alvin Kamara, and it's the equivalent of having someone who's trying to quit smoking, but when you wake up in the morning, you leave a pack of smokes next to the bed, and they can't get out of bed the morning without having that pack of smokes. And that is now Derek Carr with chucking it down to Alvin Kamara, and that we saw that clearly on Thursday night. So Alvin Kamara now is at 24.8% target share on the season, which is over 8% higher than the next closest. And we know what that does in fantasy football. There's a reason he has 21.2 points per game, because he doesn't need to be an extremely efficient rusher. And even then, the New Orleans Saints are giving him 60% carry percentage with Jamal Williams back. It's sure, maybe when he gets a little healthier, could go back, but we saw how inefficient Jamal Williams was too. So they have inefficient rushers. Alvin Kamara is not the most efficient, but the guy is still terrific in the receiving game and has 20 point per game upside, well within his range of outcomes as we've seen. So he's someone who you could take, even like a Derrick Henry plus a third or something like that. And all of a sudden you're vaulting yourself up from 13, 14 points per game to possible 20 points per game. That's a lot easier to get than through rushing production. There are so many good pivots for you to make to get to an Alvin Kamara, because he's someone who has RB1 overall range of outcomes, top 3 well within there, and you can get him for fringe running back 1 prices still as a contender. He's honestly still a pretty strong buy if you're trying to contend.
Give me a young player that a contender can flip 1-for-1 for Kamara, where consensus might prefer the young player, and you'd say, no. You're 5-2, you're 6-1. You need an Alvin Kamara on your team.
I think someone like Isaiah Pacheco, or you could even go DeAndre Swift, like one of those two where running back itself is already a fragile position. So age should play, yes, a part in it. But you're looking at someone, okay, I could go up 8 points per game, very likely, or whatever it may be, 6 points per game, and it's not costing me anything aside from some youth at a very fragile position.
Now, let's talk about Travis Etienne. But before we do that, just a reminder, everyone, rushing does not score fantasy points. And that's the case with ETN. We'll talk about his pass game usage in a second. But when we look at the running back like Alvin Kamara, if you're getting 15 carries a game, 1 yard per carry difference is massive for rushing efficiency. It's the same as getting an extra catch a game if you play in PPR leagues. That is why we are going to be incredibly bullish on a player like Kamara. And now let's talk about ETN, whose pass game usage has been pretty solid. This year, 18 carries a game. We love that volume. 4 targets a game. It's gone significantly up from last year. His target share is actually 50% higher than last year. He's averaging 100 total yards a game, 19 fantasy points a game. Tank Bigsby's been pretty much phased out of the offense after a couple games early on where he looked like a touchdown vulture. When I look at a consensus dynasty ranking site like Keep Trade Cut, I can see that Jalen Waddle is the same age as ETN, and he's the same value. What's your outlook right now for ETN? And is it the craziest thing ever just to flip Jalen Waddle for Travis Etienne if you're 5-2 or 6-1 right now?
No, I don't think that's crazy at all. You're getting strong running back production that's very likely to continue rest of season. And this was a great segment into rushing efficiency not mattering all that much in terms of scoring fantasy points when we talk about Travis Etienne. Because if we look at Travis Etienne last year, he was one of the most efficient rushers in the whole league. In fact, if we look at second-year running backs, the only second-year running backs to average 2.5 or more yards per team rush attempt and not even have a 50% carry percentage is him and Jamal Charles. Travis Etienne was one of the most efficient rushers of the football. And then what happens this year? Well, he goes from a 7.5% target share to an 11.9% target share. And more importantly, his usage goes from 48% as a rusher to 60%. And actually his yards per team rush attempt is worse. So his efficiency is much worse than it was last season. But because of the volume that he's getting, and more importantly, because he upped his target share by so much and he's becoming more prominent in the receiving game, you now have someone that went from running back 2, fringe running back 2 range to right now 19.4 points per game. And his rushing efficiency has kind of fallen off the map since year 2, which also I think makes him a regression candidate to be a better rusher because we've seen it and we saw it in college. This is the one year where his rushing efficiency has also been down. So it's one thing where he's a regression candidate, as well as being someone who he's getting the workload that you absolutely want and just proving that rushing efficiency doesn't matter all too much when scoring fantasy points.
Speaking of rushing efficiency, that segues perfectly into our third running back, Devon Achane. Achane's returning from IR in 2 weeks. He just casually averaged 34 fantasy points a game in his last 3 games prior to the injury when he was a starter. And he was averaging 34 fantasy points a game on 12 carries and 3 targets. Reminder for anyone that forgot what happened 5 minutes ago, we talked about Alvin Kamara, who averaged this year 17 carries and 10 targets a game. Achane down at 12 carries, 3 targets a game. The efficiency is going to decline sharply. He's been averaging over 12 yards a carry as the starter. However, it's the right offense in Miami. He looks himself like he could be sort of in that Jamal Charles, Chris Johnson type mold. He's a year younger right now than Kenneth Walker. When I look at dynasty rankings, Kenneth Walker is always ranked ahead of Devon Achane. Personally, I think I'd lean Achane. Talk me through how you're viewing him in dynasty, because we've got the one side, we have the unsustainable efficiency. I understand, folks. He's not going to average 12 yards a carry the rest of his career, but it's the right talent in the right offense. How are you making sense of what we should be doing with Mr. Achane?
Well, first of all, when we look back at his college profile to now, he's the only running back that I've had in my database whose name has now changed in pronunciation for the 3rd time. So I'm very curious going into year 2 what his name pronunciation is going to change to. But most importantly, when talking about fantasy here, like Josh brought up, he's someone who a regression candidate for his efficiency. And yes, that's absolutely true. The guy's not going to average 12.1 yards per carry. That's simply ridiculous. But the other thing is, it can regress and him still be the most efficient running back in the league. Because when we do look at his prospect profile, okay, his freshman year, not a lot of carries, still finds a way to be the most efficient rusher of the football on the team. Second year, behind Isaiah Spiller, but gets a bigger workload, still by far the most efficient rusher on the team. His final year, he gets the biggest bulk, so he has the highest workload, still finds a way to be the most efficient rusher on the team. Then we go into, well, now he's on a team that has proven it just creates the most efficient rushing game in the NFL, which we've seen with Raheem Mostert. We've seen with Jeff Wilson at times. And now you have someone who's been a very efficient rusher of the football in college football. And he's very young and a top pick. And you have someone who's very clearly the best rusher of the football on the team. And he's in the most efficient rushing offense. So, yes, he's a regression candidate. It's very likely he's not going to be 12.1 yards per carry or anything like that. But it's also kind of likely that he's also the most efficient rusher of the football or just the most efficient running back in the whole league. Like, this is someone right now, when you look at it, he's scoring 25.4 points per game on a 36.9% carry percentage. That is simply ridiculous. To go and find the next rusher in terms of, or the lowest carry percentage that's below 40%, the highest points per game for a rusher with below 40% carry percentage is Bijan Robinson with 13.6. And that's also thanks in part to Arthur Smith, giving him one play because he was feeling a little sick. But yes, it just shows you how ridiculous Devon Achane really has been. And while he's a regression candidate, he will be just fine. He's someone like you brought up. Kenneth Walker is a great point. I have a team where I straight up flipped Kenneth Walker for Devon Achane, straight up 1-for-1. And I feel absolutely fantastic about the move.
Guys, Ian is Dynasty_IM on Twitter. Make sure you're checking out the free 33rd Team Discord. It's linked in my Twitter bio at JLarkyTweets. It's linked in all the articles that we put out on the 33rdteam.com. Talk Dynasty, talk redraft, start sit questions, trade questions. Will help you with those. We have player prop bets that a team of half a dozen of us are posting in there throughout each week as well. Let's turn to receivers. Brandon Ayuk. He cemented himself this year now. He's the clear wide receiver 1 in San Francisco. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I'll toot my own horn. I think I was the only person out there that ranked him ahead of Deebo Samuel for fantasy football this year. People thought that was crazy. I will score one victory lap for myself. But back on topic, looks like long-term he's paired with Brock Purdy. He's going to be paired with Kyle Shanahan. I don't know why Ayuk's going anywhere. When you're getting a competent quarterback, one of the NFL's best play callers of all time, that is generally a recipe for success. Right now, consensus rankings have Devonta Smith firmly ahead of Brandon Ayuk. And personally, I would consider flipping Devonta Smith for Brandon Ayuk right now. If I'm a contender, maybe even if I'm a rebuilder, they're less than a year apart. I don't see Devonta Smith leaving the Eagles anytime soon. I don't see A.J. Brown leaving the Eagles anytime soon. I don't see Jalen Hurts leaving the Eagles anytime soon. So I think a frustrating dynamic might be in store for Devonta Smith the next few years. Meanwhile, Brandon Ayuk looks like the clear top option for a stationary quarterback that's going to have a lot of pass attempts in this offense. Am I crazy for starting to steamroll and build on the momentum? We nailed the Brandon Ayuk redraft call. Am I in like these uncharted waters with also starting to want to flip Devonta Smith for Mr. Ayuk?
No, I don't think you are at all. That is a move I'm 100% making. And the dynasty rankings that we have on the 33rd team site also show and have shown for quite a few weeks now that is a move we'd make. In fact, we have Brandon Ayuk as a dynasty wide receiver 1, someone who you should absolutely love. And actually, the only thing keeping Brandon Ayuk back right now from a clear wide receiver 1 season is the low passing volume in San Francisco. Just 27.7 pass attempts per game, good for one of the lowest in the league. But the thing is, that's something that we could see be upped in all honesty, because Brock Purdy has been a fine pocket passer. He's not a rushing quarterback. And while the San Francisco 49ers have continuously operated at a rather low rate, they're still a team that finds themselves usually between 30, 33 pass attempts, which if that's something that Ayuk had right now, he's a wide receiver 1. The guy is scoring 15.5 points per game, right outside wide receiver 1 range, on a team that's not throwing the ball basically at all. One of the lowest in the league, if not the lowest. But it comes from a 25.9% target share, 3.07 yards per team pass attempt, and a whopping 3.25 yards per route run, which when we look in minimum 80%, 75% route participation, that only trails Tyreek Hill. Brandon Ayuk has absolutely been legit, and it's something like you said, if I could take Devonta Smith and flip him for Brandon Ayuk right now, I am. One thing that I do in the offseason is I create ruse or range of outcomes for players. And even after a doghouse second year, the underlying peripherals have always loved Ayuk. In fact, the only player heading into his 4th season in his range of outcomes was Cooper Kupp. And it's really showing here in season 4.
Speaking of Cooper Kupp, let's turn to the Rams and Puka Nacua. We've seen 3 games with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp on the field together this year. And Puka, he's been really good. The target shares in those 3 games were 32%, 33%, and 44%. I generally say that anything above 20% is good, 25% very good, 30% elite. So we now have 3 pretty elite target earning performances alongside Kupp. The fantasy points have been awesome as well. Fantasy wide receiver 1 caliber, 17 PPR points a game in those 3 games. Puka Nacua, he's only 22 years old. He's pacing for the most historic season by a rookie wide receiver ever, on pace for more than 1,800 receiving yards. No rookie receiver has even hit 1,500 in a season. Matthew Stafford, when I looked at the contract, just to confirm, really looks like he's tied to the Rams for the next 3 seasons, unless the Rams want to eat an absolutely ridiculous amount of dead money. Is there any reason at this point to believe the good times stop rolling with Mr. Puka Nacua, or are you becoming an aggressive buyer at the midpoint of this season when it seems like people are still dragging their feet on him because of the draft capital?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's a lot of things to untangle with Puka Nacua, but most importantly, he is someone that we want to aggressively buy. As we mentioned with the rankings, Puka Nacua is someone that since the season started, we have continuously been ahead of consensus. And at this point, it doesn't make sense why consensus is so far behind in valuing Puka Nacua. Puka Nacua is actually someone who has a much better argument for wide receiver 3 than wide receiver 12 at this point because of what he's doing. And Josh brought up a good point. The draft capital seems to be the only thing holding him back. Let's not forget Amon-Ra St. Brown just a couple years ago, who didn't do anything until the back half of the season, was getting held back because of the draft capital attached, and TJ Hawkinson was hurt. Okay, let's play this with Cooper Kupp, with Puka Nacua, who started the season on fire. And then, okay, well, Cooper Kupp still hasn't came back yet. We need that guy next to him. Well, like Josh mentioned, Puka Nacua, before Cooper Kupp came into the fold and returned from IR, Puka Nacua averaged a 30.5% target share. Since Cooper Kupp has returned, 33.4%. His target share has gotten better. His points per game is still at 17 points per game, like Josh mentioned, just with Cooper Kupp. And not just that, he is a young rookie who we can expect this to continue the rest of the season. He's shown he can do it next to Kupp. He's shown he could do it on his own without Kupp. He's shown that he can do everything you want. He just doesn't have that draft capital attached. Let that be the reason that you can get him for much cheaper than he really should be. Because when we talk about values a lot of the time, we're talking about values because the underlying peripherals say that this guy is a lot better than consensus says. And while that's still true with Puka, he's scoring an absolute crapload of fantasy points in the process of being undervalued. You really don't see this buy opportunity happen too often.
Yeah, people out there, they're holding their nose. They're like, oh my God, I have to pay a top 10 price for Puka. If he was taken in the first round of the NFL draft, like you mentioned with wide receiver 3, why wouldn't he be in the top 3 conversation where that elite tier would be Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, and then Puka Nacua? 20 fantasy points a game as a 22-year-old rookie. It's time to buy some Puka Nacua. We're gonna go through this guy quickly. He's a little less interesting, but I think it's important because he's on a lot of dynasty teams, and that's DeAndre Hopkins. He's 31 years old. His target share has been at least 21% in every game this year, but because the Titans don't pass much, that's still amounting to just 8 targets, 4.5 catches, 63 yards, and 11 PPR fantasy points per game. Though, to be fair, he hasn't scored a touchdown yet this year. My expected fantasy points model looks at the actual usage. It sees all the red zone and end zone targets he's getting. It thinks he should be closer to 14 fantasy points a game instead of 11. However, we are about to get the first taste of the Will Levis experience on Sunday. If Will Levis flames out, then you get Malik Willis, who started 3 games last year and blows me away to say this, never reached 100 passing yards in any of those 3 games. So the next month, the quarterback situation is going to be terrifying. Do you think Hopkins is a sell, given that he's 31 and that he's going to be playing with Malik Willis and Will Levis the next month? Or would you be buying and hoping that for some reason a contending NFL team takes him, and then suddenly the 14 expected fantasy points a game based on usage might actually be realized, and suddenly you've got a fantasy wide receiver 2 on your hands if you're a contending dynasty team?
Yes, you brought up every important aspect when it comes to the DeAndre Hopkins profile. He's looked very good this year. Like you said, and your expected points per game model has him at 14 points per game on an offense with absolutely terrible efficiency. And not just that, one of the lowest passing volumes in the entire league. So we have someone who's basically in one of the worst offenses that you want to be in as a fantasy wide receiver. That's pretty much without question. The peripheral say is fantastic, but possibly most importantly is that we're seeing this team lose. And there's become rumblings of possible trade deadline moves. Now, while we don't know 100% if that's going to happen or not, the reason that I'll be investing a couple shares as a contender into Hopkins, where you're really not paying much right now. He's like in the wide receiver 40s range. He doesn't cost you too much because, well, he's not providing meaningful production. But his usage and his peripheral set, he's actually having a really good year. All it takes is one move, which right now any move to a different team is basically a positive because it's much better than the situation he's in. And then you also have the low probability that it ends up being a jackpot move where he ends up in an awesome situation. And if these peripherals were in an awesome situation, you're looking at someone who's scoring like a Cooper Kupp right now, like a Devontae Adams right now. So he is someone that I would be investing in a couple of my contenders, very low risk moves, very low risk assets to try and acquire.
Let's turn to tight ends. Our first of three is TJ Hawkinson. To this point in the season, Hawkinson has kept last year's ridiculous role that he had with the Vikings. He's second behind Travis Kelce in most categories. He just signed a massive extension with the Vikings. He's now the highest paid tight end in the NFL. But we've got some organizational instability. Kirk Cousins might be gone after this season. Justin Jefferson hasn't been extended yet either. It feels like the Vikings could completely crater after this year. But if Jefferson stay, then Hawkinson suddenly is starting to look like a pretty good bet. The consensus, Dynasty tight end 4 price tag. I mean, Hawkinson, great stats. Younger than I thought. I thought he was 28 for some reason in my head. He is still only 26 years old. He's not even 26 and a half yet. So it's definitely a player that you want to get right because his prime is going to go on for another 5 or 6 seasons at the tight end position. Back-to-back games without Jefferson now, 27% target shares in each of them. Is Hawkinson a buy or a sell?
Hawkinson is a whole different contender because you're still getting top 3 tight end production right now. But on a rebuilder, he's someone that I'm actually looking to move right now. And actually, even if I'm on a contender, if I can just add a little bit and move up to a Mark Andrews, which is definitely something I do, and I don't think is totally out of the question. It's not like we're moving up for a Travis Kelce. You're moving up for what says right now is 0.9 points per game higher with Mark Andrews. And the difference here being that TJ Hawkinson keeps getting away with okay peripherals, but because of the situation that he's on, all of a sudden his points per game in a pretty much wasteland tight end position looks rather strong. Like he came from the Lions where Jared Goff is an efficient quarterback and they threw the ball near a league high rate. Now he goes to Minnesota where they're throwing the ball higher than a league high rate at the very tipping top of the mountain. And as we know, Kirk Cousins is also efficient. This guy is hitting situation jackpots because we're seeing someone that has a 21.1% target share, 1.39 yards per team pass attempt, that if you're just looking at the peripherals, you say, okay, I mean, he's an all right tight end. He's a dynasty tight end 1, clearly. But when we're talking about Kelce, we're talking about Andrews. So those guys do it with strong peripherals. Like when we're talking about situation, Mark Andrews is scoring 0.9 points per game higher on a team that's throwing almost 12 less pass attempts per game. What does that tell you? That tells you that Mark Andrews is really good. He's just in a situation that usually doesn't allow for too much fantasy success or a limited ceiling. But we see this guy 18 points per game. TJ Hawkinson is underperforming for a situation because his peripherals are not great. So he's someone that, yes, this situation this season isn't going to totally implode. Most likely, we're not going to see Kirk Cousins get traded in all likelihood. We're not going to see that situation you talk about crater right now. But after this season, going into offseason, you could have this tight end asset whose peripherals are just okay, and the situation is no longer as tantalizing as it's been.
We have a new podcast series that we just started with Player Profiler. That is how many of you that listen to the show probably first heard about me, is when I was there for nearly half a decade. Today we had our first episode, happened earlier. We hit the quarterback position. Next week, running back position. Week after receiver, week after tight end. Going over the rookies and second-year players, talking about what they've done so far, rest of career outlook. And that show was recorded by myself, Ryan Reynolds, and then the director of podcasting at Player Profiler, Theo Greminger. Great show. Would recommend everyone check that out. That's going to be in the 33rd Team Podcast Network feed. It's going to be up on our YouTube later today. The live stream's already on Twitter. And we ended that show actually talking about Caleb Williams' landing spots. And I discussed that Caleb Williams still has some potential actually to be a Minnesota Viking. I think that'd be very interesting. Vikings right now I think are worse than many people realize. We got through TJ Hawkinson. Let's talk about two super young tight ends now. These are the guys we can really, really get excited about because their careers are just starting to blossom. Let's talk about Trey McBride of the Cardinals because Zach Ertz went on injured reserve yesterday. He's out at least 4 weeks with a quad injury. This year, we've liked Zach Ertz for fantasy if you're in a tight end premium league because the guy is just getting so many targets and we like those receptions. You dig into McBride and you realize he's actually been targeted on the same percentage of his routes as Ertz this year, but he's been twice as efficient per route with yardage. McBride runs a 4.6 40 time, the same as Travis Kelce. Kyler Murray should return in week 9. When we look at Keep Trade Cut consensus Dynasty rankings site, we see that even guys like David Njoku and Dalton Schultz, who are 3.5 years older than McBride, are still ranked ahead of him. McBride down all the way at tight end 18. To me, in my unbiased opinion, I think he's a borderline top 10 Dynasty tight end right now. Am I crazy, or does the market need to rapidly adjust? Not just because Zach Ertz went on IR, but simply because even before that, McBride had already been outplaying him and outproducing him on slightly fewer routes.
Yeah, so in the rankings that you can check out on the 33rd Team site, I actually have him at tight end 14, so we're right around Dynasty tight end 1 range, which isn't a great place. It jumbles around quite a bit, but these are the intriguing things that you like to see when moving a guy up. Because when we talk about tight ends, we're talking about per route usage, and if they get that usage and they're used more in the receiving game, then we all of a sudden have a productive tight end. So I tweeted about Trey McBride today because, as Josh mentioned, his per route statistics are very good. When we look at all guys with at least a 30% route participation, his target rate ranks 5th. His yards per run ranks 4th. So he's someone who's been very efficient when he's been able to be a receiver or used as a receiver. So now that we have Zach Ertz going down, who had over 70% route participation, was doubling the receiving routes that Zach Ertz was doubling what Trey McBride had. And now we're in a situation where Zach Ertz is the one on IR. He's someone who's not going to be available the next 4 weeks, which likely vaults Trey McBride into a position to run a lot more routes. And if this efficiency can carry over, he's someone who's definitely very intriguing. Definitely understand why you can have him as a top 10 tight end rest of season because of this. And it could be one of those things where Zach Ertz comes back and they're like, wow, this guy, he's blossomed, which is great for someone who was a solid prospect last year and really underwhelmed also on a per route basis where he wasn't very good last year. But all of a sudden this year, we're seeing that per route metrics start to climb, starts getting very intriguing. And now we're finally heading into week 8. We have someone who could be running 70% of the routes in week 8. And you look up and this guy is now scoring like a top 10 tight end.
Guys, if you want rankings, Ian's Dynasty rankings are free on the 33rdteam.com. My redraft week 8 rankings are also up on the site, and my rest of season rankings and trade value chart that you can download. It's color coded. I think it's the best version that's out there right now if you want to make trades, because simply put, you can't just do casual 3-for-1s and get a player like a McCaffrey, like a Tyreek Hill. You'll see, just like how you're going to personally value the good players really highly, the value cliff is super steep. I have very, very, very few players that you would even be able to put into trades to just get an offer going for some of those elite talents, which is exactly how it should be. All of this is free on the 33rdteam.com. We'll get you out of here, folks, with some Dalton Kincaid talk. Dawson Knox is out indefinitely. He just underwent wrist surgery. Kincaid really hasn't done much of anything prior to week 7. Week 7, though, it was great. He was targeted 8 times, career high. He caught all of them. So 8 catches, 75 receiving yards. Yet on the season, when we zoom back out, he's played 6 games. He's averaged 4.5 targets, 4 catches, just 32 yards per game, and that's translated to 7 PPR fantasy points a game. The stock, though, with the Dawson Knox news is going up. Stocks are going up. Yet when I look at Kincaid and I zoom out a little bit, I'm a little bit concerned. What if his value is really tied to round one draft capital and the Bills offense? How should dynasty managers handle the Dawson Knox surgery and the inflating Dalton Kincaid value spike?
This is one of those things where I'm actually pretty cool kind of flipping Kincaid for someone who is a proven producer, someone who, or you could flip him straight up for some very, very strong draft capital in terms of your dynasty teams, or in redraft, you could flip him for a Kyle Pitts, for example. Right now, I think that's very viable because I think in redraft, at least, they're probably around the same value. And Pitts, who's been getting healthier, his per route numbers look great. They have been for 2 years. And the Falcons are throwing actually at an adequate rate that we've actually seen scoring from Kyle Pitts. So he's someone I'm cool flipping for. There's a lot of ways to get out of Kincaid, even though I think he'll be all right and run a lot of routes. But the thing is, when we talk about, okay, Dawson Knox is hurt, so that means that Dalton Kincaid's going to do what we just talked about with Trey McBride. Okay, here's the difference. Dalton Kincaid has already been running 69% of the routes. So it's not like he hasn't been on the field running routes. He might get a slight bump there, but it's not like he hasn't been doing that. So on the season so far, maybe his target rate takes up a little bit, but it's not like Dawson Knox has been anything close to a target hog. He's hardly been usable in most formats. So he's someone where, okay, he goes down. It's not quite the same thing we're talking about in an Ertz McBride situation because Kincaid's running the routes. But that's not even my biggest concern because I think Dalton Kincaid will find a way to get targets. They showed that last week. He had a career high 19.5% target share last week. But my big thing is where he's getting those targets. Because when we talk about tight end upside, tight end production, it's very dependent upon, okay, where's the tight end getting his targets? Because in the sense of Dalton Kincaid, even in his breakout week, like we saw this past week, where he got those 8 targets, he got the production that we were finally waiting to see with 19.5 points in tight end premium formats. Okay, that's great. Where do you get those targets? Because we want to see the underlying peripherals. Well, it was still just a 4.6 average depth of target, which made his average depth of target on the season 4.3. No matter how you slice it, that's not good. In fact, of all rookie tight ends to have a less than 5 average depth of target, there's been 27 of them. Not a single one has ever had a 17-plus point per game season. So where is the true upside with Dalton Kincaid?
Guys, you heard it here first. Flip Dalton Kincaid for Kyle Pitts. And when Kirk Cousins is on the Falcons next year, you can have the last laugh. From myself, Josh Larky, from Ian Miller, from the 33rd team. Thank you, everyone.